loud. Then I caught a cab on the corner and headed uptown. We had quite a night, Jerry and I. I got home just about time to start for work. And sure enough, there was George Prime starting my car, business suit on, briefcase under his arm. I pushed the recall and George Prime got out of the car and walked into the workshop. He stepped into his cradle in the closet. I turned him off and then drove away in the car. Bless his metallic soul, he'd even kissed Marge goodbye for me. Needless to say, the affairs of George Faircloth took on a new sparkle with George Prime on hand to cover the home front. For the first week, I was hardly home at all. I must say I felt a little guilty, leaving poor old George Prime to cope with Marge all the time. He looked and acted so human, it was easy to forget that he literally couldn't care less. But I felt apologetic all the same, whenever I took him out of his closet. She's really a sweet girl underneath it all, I'd say. You'll learn to like her after a little bit. Of course I like her, George Prime said. You told me, didn't you? Stop worrying. She's really a sweet girl underneath it all. He sounded convincing enough, but it still bothered me. You're sure you understand the exchange mechanism? I asked. I didn't want any foul-ups there, as you can imagine. Perfectly, said George Prime. When you buzz the recall, I wait for the logical opportunity to come out to the workshop and you take over. But you might get nervous. You might inadvertently tip her off. George Prime looked pained. Really, old man, I'm a super deluxe model, remember? I don't have 14 activated Hunyadi tubes up in this cranial vault of mine just for nothing. You're the one that's nervous. I'll take care of everything. Relax. So I did. Jerry made good all her tacit promises and then some. She had a very cozy little apartment on 34th Street where we went to relax after a hard day at the office. When we weren't doing the town, that is. As long as Jerry didn't try too much conversation, everything was wonderful. And then, when Jerry got a little boring, there was Sybil in the accounting department, or Dorothy in promotion, or Jane, or Ingrid. I could go on at some length, but I won't. I was building quite a reputation for myself around the office. Of course, it was like buying your first 3V set. In a week or so, the novelty wears off a little and you start eating on schedule again. It took a little while, but I finally had things down to a reasonable program. Tuesdays and Thursday nights I was informally out while formally in. Sometimes I took Sunday nights out if things got too sticky around the house over the weekend. The rest of the time, George Prime cooled his heels in his closet. Locked up, of course. Can't completely trust a wife to observe a taboo, no matter how well trained she is. There was an irreconcilable amount of risk. George Prime had to quick-step some questions about my work at the office. There was no way to supply him with current data until the time for his regular 2-month refill and pattern accommodation at the laboratory. In the meantime, George Prime had to make do with what he had. But as he himself pointed out, he was a super deluxe model. Marge didn't suspect a thing. In fact, George Prime seemed to be having a remarkable effect on her. I didn't notice anything at first. I was hardly ever home. But one night I found my pipe and slippers laid out for me, and the evening paper neatly folded on my chair, and it brought me up short. Marge had been extremely docile lately. We hadn't had a good fight in days. Weeks, come to think of it. I thought it over and shrugged. Old age, I figured. She was bound to mellow sometime. But pretty soon I began to wonder if she wasn't mellowing a little too much. One night when I got home, she kissed me almost as though she really meant it. There wasn't an unpleasant word all through dinner, which happened to be steak with mushrooms, served in the dining room, by candlelight, with dinner music that Marge could never bear, chiefly because I liked it. We sat over coffee and cigarettes, and it seemed almost like old times. Very old times, in fact. I even caught myself looking at Marge again, really looking at her, watching the light catch in her hair, almost admiring the sparkle in her brown eyes. Sparkle, I said, not glint. As I mentioned before, Marge was always easy to look at. That night she was practically ravishing. "What are you doing to her?" I asked George Prime later, out in the workshop. "Why, nothing," said George Prime, looking innocent. He couldn't fool me with his look, though, because it was exactly the look I use when I'm guilty and pretending to be innocent. There must be something. George Prime shrugged. "Any woman will warm up if you spend time telling her all the things she wants to hear and pay all the attention to her that she wants paid to her. That's elemental psychology. I can give you page references." I ought to mention that George Prime had a complete set of basic texts run into his circuits, at a slightly additional charge. Never can tell when an odd bit of information will come in useful. "Well, you must be doing quite a job," I said. I'd never managed to warm Marge up much. "I try," said George Prime. "Oh, I'm not complaining," I hastened to add, forgetting that a Prime's feelings can't be hurt and that he was only acting like me because it was in character. "I was just curious." "Of course, George. I'm really delighted that you're doing so well." "Thank you, George." But the next night when I was with Dawn, who happens to be a gorgeous redhead who could put Marge to shame on practically any field of battle except maybe brains, I kept thinking about Marge all evening long, and wondering if things weren't getting just a little out of hand. The next evening I almost tripped over George Prime coming out of a liquor store. I ducked quickly into an alley and flagged him. "What are you doing out on the street?" He gave me my martyred look. "Just buying some bourbon. You were out." "But you're not supposed to be off the premises." "Marge asked me to come. I couldn't tell her I was sorry, but her husband wouldn't let me, could I?" "Well, certainly not. You want me to keep her happy, don't you? You don't want her to get suspicious." "No, but suppose somebody saw us together. If she ever got a hint—" "I'm sorry," George Prime said contritely. "It seems the right thing to do. You would have done it. At least that's what my judgment center maintained. We had quite an argument." "Well, tell your judgment center to use a little sense," I snapped. "I don't want it to happen again." The next night I stayed home, even though it was Tuesday night. I was beginning to get worried. Of course I did have complete control. I could snap George Prime off any time I wanted, or even take him in for a complete recircuiting, but it seemed a pity. He was doing such a nice job. Marge was docile as a kitten, even more so than before. She sympathized with my hard day at the office and agreed heartily that the boss, despite all appearances, was in reality a jabbering idiot. After dinner I suggested a movie, but Marge gave me an odd sort of look, and said that she thought it would be much nicer to spend the evening at home by the fire. I'd just gotten settled with the paper when she came into the living room and sat down beside me. She was wearing some sort of filmy affair I'd never laid eyes on before, and I caught a whiff of my favorite perfume. "Georgie," she said. "Huh? Do you still love me?" I set the paper down and stared at her. "How's that? Of course I still—" "Well, sometimes you don't act much like it." I guess I've got an awful headache tonight. Damn that perfume." "Oh," said Marge. "In fact, I thought I'd turn in early and get some sleep." "Sleep," said Marge. There was no mistaking the disappointment in her voice. Now I knew that things were out of hand. The next evening I activated George Prime and caught the taxi at the corner, but I called Ruby and broke my date with her. I took in an early movie alone and was back at 10 o'clock. I left the cab at the corner and walked quietly up the path toward the garage. Then I stopped. I could see Marge and George Prime through the living room windows. George Prime was kissing my wife the way I hadn't kissed her in 8 long years. It made my hair stand on end. And Marge wasn't exactly fighting him off either. She was coming back for more. After a little the lights went off. George Prime was a super deluxe model, all right. I dashed into the workshop and punched the recall button as hard as I could, swearing under my breath. How long has this been going on? I punched the button again viciously and waited. George Prime didn't come out. It was plenty cold out in the workshop that night, and I didn't sleep a wink. About dawn, out came George Prime, looking like a man with a 4-day hangover. Our conversation got down to fundamentals. George Prime kept insisting blandly that, according to my own directions, he was to pick the first logical opportunity to come out when I buzzed, and that was exactly what he'd done. I was furious all the way to work. I'd take care of this nonsense all right. I'd have George Prime rewired from top to bottom as soon as the laboratory could take him. But I never phoned the laboratory. The bank was calling me when I got to the office. They wanted to know what I planned to do about that check of mine that had just bounced. "What check?" I asked. "The one you wrote to cash yesterday. $500 against your regular account, Mr. Faircloth." The last I'd looked, I had about $3,000 in that account. I told the man so rather bluntly. "Oh, no, sir. That is, you did until last week. But all these checks you've been cashing have emptied the account." He flashed the checks on the desk screen. My signature was on every one of them. What about my special account? I'd learned long before that an account Marge didn't know about was sound rearguard strategy. That's been closed out for 2 weeks. I hadn't written a check against that account for over a year. I glared at the ceiling and tried to think things through. I came up with a horrible thought. Marge had always had her heart set on a trip to Bermuda. Just to get away from it all, she'd say. A second honeymoon. I got a list of travel agencies from the business directory and stared down them. The third one I tried had a pleasant tenor voice. "No, sir, not Mrs. Faircloth. You bought 2 tickets, one way. Champagne flight to Bermuda." "When?" I choked out. "Why, today, as a matter of fact. It leaves Idlewild at 11 o'clock." I let him worry about my amnesia and started home fast. I didn't know what they'd given that Prime for circuits, but there was no question now that he was out of control, way out of control. And poor Marge, all worked up for a second honeymoon. Then it struck me. Poor Marge? Poor sucker George! No Prime in his right circuits would behave this way without some human guidance, and that meant only one thing. Marge had spotted him. It had happened before. Couple of nasty court battles I'd read about. And she'd known all about George Prime. For how long? When I got home, the house was empty. George Prime wasn't in his closet, and Marge wasn't in the house. They were gone. I started to call the police, but I caught myself just in time. I couldn't very well complain to the cops that my wife had run off with an android. Worse yet, I could get 20 years for having an illegal Prime wandering around. I sat down and poured myself a stiff drink. My own wife deserting me for a pile of bearings. It was indecent. Then I heard the front door open, and there was Marge, her arms full of grocery bundles. "Why, darling, you're home early." I just blinked for a moment. Then I said, "You're still here." "Of course. Where did you think I'd be?" "But I mean the ticket office." She set down the bundles and kissed me and looked into my eyes, almost smiling, half reproachful. "You didn't really think I'd go running off with something out of a lab, did you?" "Then you knew?" "Certainly I knew, silly. You didn't do a very good job of instructing him either. You gave him far too much latitude. Let him have ideas of his own and all that. The next thing I knew, he was trying to get me to run off with him to Hawaii or someplace." "Bermuda," I said. And then Marge was in my arms, kissing me and snuggling her cheek against my chest. "Even though he looked like you, I knew he couldn't be," she said. "He was like you, but he wasn't you, darling. And all I ever want is you. I just never appreciated you before." I held her close and tried to keep my hands from shaking.